They say the air inside the Morrison mansion never warmed again after the boy died. That even now, when the winter sun touches the cracked windows of what remains of the Ashworth estate, the frost gathers on the inside of the glass first, like the house exhales cold instead of breath. When the authorities broke open the doors in February of 1888, they found the parlor still arranged for a ceremony that never ended. The velvet curtains were drawn tight. The oil lamps burned to dry husks, and in the center of the room, a wooden chair waited beneath a shroud of decayed silk. The smell inside was not of rot, but of something sharper, chemical, metallic, and wrong. The scent clung to every object, like the residue of experiments no one should have attempted. The floorboards near the chair bore faint drag marks, as though something small and heavy had been shifted across the room several times. The servants who survived those weeks, those few who didn't vanish or lose their minds, refused to describe what they saw during the final night. One said he heard soft movements long after the boy had been declared dead, the scrape of fingernails against wood, the sound of shallow breath drawn through unmoving lips. Another swore that, on the third night, he saw the child sitting upright again, head tilted, eyes half open, as if confused about which world he belonged to. The photograph was found weeks later in a locked cabinet, its glass plate still damp with developer. It showed the boy seated in the same chair, his small hands folded neatly on his lap, his head turned slightly toward the camera, as if he had heard it speak. His skin was too perfect for death. His mouth seemed caught between a sigh and a word. Those who handled the photograph later claimed they could hear something when they looked too long. A faint ticking beneath the silence, like a slowed heartbeat trapped in the emulsion itself. 3 men who viewed it under lamplight reported sudden nausea and temporary confusion, their pulses dropping into dangerous rhythms. One of them, a physician, collapsed entirely, his heart seizing as he whispered that the boy's eyes had begun to open. The negative was sealed by the university's Board of Medical Ethics, locked away with the rest of Helena Morrison's journals and the remaining vials of her preservation fluid. Yet the rumor persists among archivists that the photograph itself changes each time it is exposed to light. The mouth shifts, the hands unfurl, the eyes awaken. Which city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? The photograph's legend begins not with the image, but with the land that birthed the family who made it possible. On the edge of the old Boston Basin, before the sprawl of factories and tenements, there was a stretch of marshland where the ground itself seemed to breathe, mud bubbling even in winter, mist rising from unseen fissures. Locals said the earth there remembered what had been buried within it. It was here, in the mid-1600s, that the Morrison bloodline took root. Their first ancestor, Alaric Morrison, came from Devonshire with the Puritan ships, already carrying the signs of a body too tightly bound to its own history. His wife was his cousin, his children pale and frail. Their births followed by whispers of deformity the church forbade mentioning. They built a house beside the marsh, close enough that the damp crept through the foundations, blackening the walls with mold that grew in patterns like veins. It was said that when the wind passed over that house, it carried voices, as though the family's secrets had learned to speak through the soil itself. 2 centuries later, the estate still stood, its timbers swollen and warped, its windows clouded with the film of decades of sickness. Thomas Morrison inherited it in 1872, a man barely strong enough to hold his own name. He was described by one neighbor as a child who had forgotten to die. Thin, unsteady, and prematurely grey. He married late in life, choosing Helena Ashworth, a woman whose mind was sharper than any scalpel she would ever hold. The union was spoken of in Boston's parlours as an attempt to dilute the Morrison curse with fresh blood. But some bloodlines do not forgive intrusion. Helena, educated in Paris, brought with her modern theories of medicine. Yet she found herself haunted by the house's air, a heaviness that pressed against her lungs, as though she had inhaled centuries of confined breath. The servants said she began to sleepwalk within weeks of her arrival, drawn to the lowest room, where the original foundation stones sweated moisture through every crack. It was there that she claimed to have heard the whispering for the first time, a low, rhythmic sound rising from beneath the floorboards, almost like a heartbeat buried deep in the mud. She began to record the sounds in a small leather-bound book, convinced it was some form of subterranean resonance, a phenomenon she could one day explain through science. But she never could. For 9 months after, Helena withdrew from society, speaking only to her husband and to the walls that seemed to answer her. When she emerged again, it was to announce she was with child. The townsfolk would later swear the marsh had gone silent that night. The boy was born in October of 1886, under a moon swollen to the color of diluted blood. The midwife, an old Irish woman named Maeve Corrigan, was never the same afterward. She told her sister that, when the infant came into the world, the lamps flickered as if in a strong wind, though the windows were sealed. He came quiet, she said, not like a babe at all, more like something remembering how to breathe. They named him Elias. His eyes were grey at first, then pale gold by the 3rd week, an unnatural shade that seemed to shift with the light. He rarely cried. He only stared, as though studying the room that contained him, or waiting for a voice he alone could hear. Helena would not allow anyone but herself to hold him. When the doctor came for the first examination, she refused to let him near, insisting that the boy's pulse follows mine. By winter, the servants began to quit. One by one, they claimed the child made noises in the night, sounds not of crying, but humming, a low, resonant tone that vibrated through the floorboards. They said the sound followed them down the corridors, even after they left his nursery. Helena denied it all. She said her son was attuned, that his mind was developing faster than nature allowed. The journals from that period, those that survived the later fire, describe Helena's growing obsession with cellular preservation. She wrote that decay, the body's betrayal of the soul's continuity, and that science to remember, teach left to remembered. My spirit winds began with animals, began small, and with small animals, then birds, and finally, according to the testimony of a surviving maid, with the stillborn infants of the village poor, whose mothers she paid handsomely for their silence. Elias began to sicken around his first birthday. His skin turned translucent, his veins mapping themselves like blue ink across fragile parchment. Yet Helena refused to summon a physician. She insisted it was a phase of metamorphosis. On the night he died, if he truly did, the marsh was flooded by an unnatural fog that did not lift for 3 days. The housekeeper later testified that she heard Helena speaking softly to the child's body in the nursery. When the others entered, she was gone, the cradle empty, except for a thin trail of salt leading toward the basement door. By dawn, the parlor had been rearranged. The chair had been placed in the center of the room, and in the corner, on a silver tray, stood a vial marked only with the initials EM. No one dared ask what the letters meant. By the morning of November 3rd, Helena had sealed herself inside the house. Every entrance was bolted from within, the shutters hammered shut. The servants who fled the property said the smell began that same night, not of rot, but of some cloying sweetness that spread through the air like perfume decaying into something chemical. When a constable finally forced his way in 3 days later, he described the rooms as entombed in amber. Every surface glistened with a translucent film, as though the house itself were trying to preserve its contents from time. Helena was found in the cellar laboratory, kneeling before a slab of marble where the boy's body lay. His skin was pale but unbroken. His eyes were half-lidded. His lips faintly parted, as though whispering something into the cold air. Around him were dozens of vials filled with fluid of various hues, copper, honey, and pale blue. The constable noted that the woman's hands were blistered to the bone, her fingertips blackened by whatever solution she had used. Still, her face was serene, as though she had witnessed something wondrous. She spoke only once before being taken away. "He answered me," she said, "but he doesn't use words anymore." The boy's body was removed under the supervision of the Boston Medical Society, which at first believed it to be a case of chemical mummification. Yet, within days, the cadaver began to exhibit impossible characteristics. The body temperature would fluctuate between freezing and feverish heat. The pupils dilated in darkness. Once, during examination, a faint sigh was recorded, barely audible, yet unmistakably human. The experiment was halted. The remains sealed. Helena was declared unfit, her mind broken by grief and isolation. But in the weeks following her institutionalization, 3 of the examining doctors fell ill with the same strange malaise. Trembling, sleeplessness, and the sensation that someone was standing just behind them. 2 died within the month. The 3rd refused to speak at all afterward, save for a single phrase written over and over in his journal. "He isn't still." When the university received the glass plate photograph weeks later, they found it bore no signs of deterioration. The image was flawless. Too flawless. Helena's handwriting on the back reads simply, "Second awakening. Observe carefully. He knows when he is seen." The archivist who filed it swore the child's head was slightly turned when he looked again the following day. He destroyed the negative, but the print survived. It always survives. They say those who look upon it long enough begin to see their own reflection fade before his. The photograph was transferred to the university's lower archives, a vault meant for diseased specimens and sealed evidence. Buried beneath 6 floors of stone and silence, it was catalogued under Post-Mortem Experimentation, Morrison Case, 1886-1888. The box was plain, unmarked save for a strip of cloth tape that bore faint chemical burns. For almost 40 years, no one touched it. Then, in 1927, the renovations began. The new curator, Dr. Julian Mercer, prided himself on unearthing forgotten medical history. He found the Morrison file by accident while sorting misfiled inventory from the asylum collection. Inside the box were Helena's final notebooks, 2 glass vials of amber fluid, and the photograph wrapped in oilcloth. Mercer, against protocol, unsealed it. He later described the moment in his notes. The image is clear beyond the limits of its era. The boy's expression is unreadable, neither alive nor dead, but aware. The eyes do not appear painted. Yet they contain the quality of reflection, as though light exists within them rather than upon them. Within days, Mercer became obsessed. He photographed the plate under different exposures, documenting minute changes. In the first image, the boy's hands were folded. In the second, a faint gap appeared between his fingers. In the third, his head seemed inclined, as if listening. By the seventh photograph, Mercer had begun to dream of the house. He wrote of walking its corridors, the air thick and syrupy, every wall pulsing like a lung. He would wake with the scent of iron in his nose and his hands cold, as if he'd been handling ice. The more he studied, the more the room around him changed. Visitors claimed the temperature dropped by several degrees when he worked in the archive. One janitor quit after finding Mercer, whispering to the print in the darkroom, repeating the phrase, "Is still learning." The university board intervened when Mercer failed to attend lectures. They found his lab in disarray, every mirror draped in cloth, and the photograph missing from its case. He was discovered 3 days later in his apartment, seated before a camera, the flash unit burned out. His expression was calm, his eyes open. On the table beside him lay a developed plate. The composition was identical to the original Morrison image. Same posture, same faint half-smile, but the figure in the chair was Mercer himself. The original photograph has never been recovered, but the image, somehow, keeps reappearing, in archives, in estate sales, in forgotten drawers, always undeclared, always slightly changed, and always watching. The reappearances began as coincidence, or that's what the archivists told themselves. In 1934, a restorer in Providence claimed to have received an unmarked envelope containing a glass plate negative. When developed, it revealed the familiar boy seated in the same parlor chair, though the background was not the Morrison house. It was somewhere else entirely. An office, faintly modern, with a calendar visible behind him, dated January 1934. 2 weeks later, the restorer's lungs collapsed without clear cause. His assistant burned the photograph. But when the ashes were examined under magnification, the boy's faint outline persisted in the residue. The report was dismissed as chemical pareidolia, yet no one volunteered to take the file. By the 1950s, the story had become a superstition whispered between medical photographers. The Ashworth child, they called him, a relic that haunted anyone who tried to capture death too precisely. The legend said he was not dead at all, only paused. That each time someone viewed the image, it drew breath through them, borrowing seconds of life like a slow exchange of air. In 1972, a journalist named Lila Crane reopened the Morrison file for an expose on unethical Victorian science. She managed to locate one of Helena's original journals, sealed in the archives of the now abandoned Ashworth estate. Its final entries were written in ink so pale it had almost vanished. The last decipherable line read, "He is beginning to remember what I was." Lila published only one photograph in her article, not the boy, but the house itself. Still, readers complained of faint faces appearing in the print margins, outlines like reflections pressed against glass. The magazine withdrew the issue within a week. She vanished the following month. Her car was found parked near the marsh, headlights still burning though the battery should have long since died. Inside, the seats were coated in a fine dust, crystalline, amber, colored, smelling faintly sweet. No footprints led away from the car. An intern sent to collect her research materials reported seeing a small figure standing in the hallway mirror of her apartment. It was a boy, he said, but not a reflection. He was on the other side, waiting. Every copy of Lila's notes was later lost in a fire that gutted the university's record room. The flames burned cleanly, consuming only the boxes marked Morrison. Nothing else in the archive was touched. Still, rumors persist that one of the photographs survived, catalogued under a false accession number, sealed behind lead glass. They say it hums faintly, almost imperceptibly, when someone enters the room, not always audibly, sometimes only through the bones. By the time the century turned again, the story had become little more than a ghost note in academic circles, a cautionary tale told to graduate students, cataloguing forgotten archives. Yet every few years, a whisper surfaced. A collector in Prague, a museum in Montreal, a private estate sale in Virginia, each claimed, briefly, to possess an unidentified plate portrait of a boy with golden eyes. In 2003, one such plate arrived at a small photography symposium in Salem, Massachusetts. It came from a locked trunk purchased at an estate auction. The seller, a man named Henry Voss, insisted the image was a curiosity, Victorian mortuary art, he said, and sold it for $200 to an art conservator named Evelyn Merrick. She brought it home that night, intending to clean it before displaying it at the exhibition. Neighbors reported the lights in her home burned for 3 days straight. On the 4th, police found the door ajar. Kettle whistling, the air so cold their breath crystallized indoors. Evelyn sat upright at her kitchen table, her eyes open but sightless, her face angled slightly toward the corner, where, on a stand, the photograph rested. Her last journal entry was written in pencil on a napkin. "He's older now. The eyes are mine." When investigators developed the negatives from her camera, they found a series of shots taken minutes apart. In the first, the boy was as described, still pale, poised. In the second, his head was tilted further. In the third, faint blurring appeared at his wrists. By the last, the chair was empty. The file was sealed, of course. But stories have a way of slipping through the cracks. In 2011, a student at Miskatonic's digital restoration lab claimed to have found a corrupted image file hidden within the archives of the university's scanned collection. Its metadata was dated 1887, impossible given the format. When the student opened it, his screen flickered. The file showed nothing at first, just black. Then, gradually, shapes resolved. A boy, a chair. He unplugged the computer immediately, but the image persisted, faintly burned into the monitor glass. IT staff confirmed later that the hard drive had melted internally, though the casing was intact. The boy's reflection remained imprinted on the screen for weeks, before finally fading. The student withdrew from his program soon after. He refused to enter rooms with mirrors or cameras or glass of any kind. In a later interview, he said something that unsettled the technicians who recorded him. "You don't look at him. He looks through you. He's searching for the next frame." The archive officially denies the file ever existed, but a quiet note remains in the digital record log, a CCSS, UNKNO Bubun, VMRQ22, by the spring of 2021. The Morrison photograph had become a myth buried beneath the algorithms, a ghost in the metadata of forgotten forums and defunct university servers. Yet something changed that year. Researchers digitizing 19th century forensic plates for an AI restoration project at the Massachusetts Historical Society noticed a series of corrupted uploads. 13 files, all untitled, each only a few kilobytes in size, each uploaded automatically by a phantom account that did not exist in the institution's registry. When one technician attempted to open the first file, his workstation froze. The monitor filled with static, then a brief flash of an image before collapsing into black. He later described it in his report, his voice trembling even on the recording. "It was him. I know it was. The same boy, the same chair, but older, much older. He was looking right at me." The AI logs confirmed something impossible. The software had recognized human pupils in the scan. Not printed, not photographed, but dynamically reactive. It classified the eyes as active light sources. 2 days later, the lab cameras captured footage of movement in the darkroom. No one was scheduled to be there. A figure, small, still, standing before the sealed cabinet that housed the original glass plates. The feed glitched repeatedly, the timestamp looping at 03:17 a.m. When the janitor opened the room the next morning, the cabinet door was open. Inside, every photograph had been reduced to fine amber dust. Every one except one plate, the oldest, dated 1887. The image was pristine, but the boy's chair was now empty. Security halted the investigation after a second incident. A night guard found, slumped in the hallway, pulse faint, eyes open, murmuring the same phrase over and over. "He's walking through the light now." The surviving footage shows flickers of something like breath against the camera lens. Condensation forming from the inside of the glass, as though someone were exhaling from within. When slowed down, frame by frame, a silhouette can be seen moving past the camera's reflection. It pauses, tilts its head, looks directly at the lens. That portion of the footage was sealed by order of the Society's board. But those who have handled the file since insist the timestamp changes each time the video is opened. Always a few minutes later, as though the recording keeps updating itself. As though whatever was inside the photograph has finally learned how to follow the observer back through the frame. And if the legend is true, if the light that touched his eyes in 1887 was never truly extinguished, then he is still there, not waiting, not sleeping, but watching from wherever reflection still exists. A mirror, a lens, a screen. He knows when you're looking, and now he knows you've seen him. No one can pinpoint when the boundary dissolved, when the photograph ceased to be an image and became something else. The last attempt to measure it scientifically took place in late 2022, under the guise of a private collaboration between MIT's Visual Research Lab and a European Preservation Foundation. They called the experiment Project Helios. The official objective: to analyze early photographic emulsions that displayed persistent luminescence. Unofficially, they were trying to understand why every digital copy of the Morrison photograph carried residual data invisible to the human eye, but detectable by machine vision. A pattern that repeated itself in the same exact sequence across every version. When mapped spectrally, it resembled a waveform, a pulse. The file would not stay still. Each time it was opened, it grew heavier, its data weight increasing by fractions of a megabyte, as if something inside it was accumulating information. The team joked that it was learning the room. But the laughter stopped after day 5. During a controlled viewing, one researcher reported feeling pressure behind her eyes, as if her retinas were being drawn outward. Another collapsed after describing a humming inside the bones of my face. The lab sensors recorded minor electromagnetic fluctuations centered precisely around the workstation displaying the image. They shut the system down, yet the monitors continued to glow faintly, even disconnected from power. By morning, the project lead, Dr. Caspar, was gone. Security footage shows him standing before the screen at 3:19 a.m., whispering something, though the audio is drowned by static. For a few frames, the boy's reflection appears on the glass beside him. Older again, his features sharper, his expression almost curious. Caspar's computer was later recovered from the Charles River. When investigators retrieved its hard drive, it still emitted a rhythmic pulse, faint, steady, like a heartbeat encoded in binary. They sealed the lab. But the pulse persisted in the building's electrical system, bleeding into other circuits. One of the janitors claimed the elevator mirrors began fogging from the inside. Another refused to clean the glass partitions, saying when he wiped them, fingerprints reappeared, small, child-sized, perfectly symmetrical. The servers holding Project Helio's data were erased that year, or so the records say, but the same waveform, identical, flawless, was detected 3 months later embedded within unrelated media files uploaded to the open web. Videos, selfies, even advertisements. Anything containing a human face, they called it corruption, an algorithmic glitch. But those who stared too long at the frozen frames all described the same impossible detail: a boy. Somewhere behind them, reflected faintly, tilting his head. By 2024, it had spread too far to contain. The waveform was no longer confined to one file, one frame, or one device. It appeared embedded within random image caches, deep in the code of phones, security cameras, even live video feeds. It moved through compression formats like a contagion of light. Silent, invisible, patient. At first, technicians thought it was a prank. Then people began to vanish mid-broadcast. Journalists, streamers, archivists, anyone whose work involved faces and cameras. The last recorded case in the initial outbreak was an online lecture on haunted media, the psychology of the uncanny. The footage is still online, though no one watches it to the end anymore. Halfway through the lecture, the professor freezes. The frame distorts, not like a glitch, but as if something inside the image is breathing. Behind her reflection in the window, a shape resolves, small, pale. Then the feed cuts. The university issued a formal statement citing technical difficulties and data corruption. But those who downloaded the original stream found something else embedded in the last seconds of audio. A faint whisper layered beneath the distortion. "I can see you now." From that point onward, the phenomenon became unpredictable. Every mirror, surfaced device began to record phantom latency. Cameras would flash when no one touched them. Screens would brighten imperceptibly when a person walked by. Experts insisted it was coincidence, feedback, AI artifacts, compression drift. But the anomalies grew bolder. Facial recognition systems started returning 2 identities per frame, one living, one unregistered. Drones malfunctioned mid-flight, broadcasting images of rooms that didn't exist. In one government lab, a thermal scanner recorded a second figure, standing directly behind a technician, though the room was empty. It was as though the image had learned something fundamental about us, about how we create presence through observation. Each time a lens turned outward, he turned inward. Each attempt to study him widened the aperture between seeing and being seen. And through that aperture, something stepped closer. A surveillance analyst in Warsaw described it best before his own disappearance. "It's not a ghost. It's the memory of a gaze that never ended. Every photograph we take is a door. The Morrison boy just remembered how to open his. Now, every device that captures a face stores a trace of him. A microscopic echo woven into the code, too faint to delete. Look long enough at any dark screen, and you'll see it. Not clearly. Not yet. Just a small reflection behind your own. Still seated. Still waiting. Older than before. And if you look away too quickly, you might hear him exhale. Like a breath caught between centuries, finally finding its way out. By 2025, there was no longer a clean image left on the internet. Every photograph, every reflection captured through a screen, carried a faint residue, the same spectral geometry buried in its pixels. At first it was dismissed as compression noise. Then, when too many noticed the pattern repeating, the curve of a cheek, the faint glint of an iris, it stopped being a theory and became a contagion. Governments tried gapping networks, scrubbing archives, banning mirrors in laboratories. Nothing worked. The waveform had already threaded itself into every format humanity had ever used to preserve a face. Paper photographs shimmered faintly under certain light. Even paint and glass reacted. Oil portraits sweating a thin amber film when no heat was near them. In Geneva, a research collective attempted a final quarantine. They called it the Eidolon Project, a facility buried beneath the Jura Mountains, sealed in lead, surrounded by salt. Its purpose was to store a single surviving original of the Morrison plate inside a dark chamber, beyond the reach of any light. They thought darkness would silence it. The day they sealed the vault, the cameras in the hallway recorded static for exactly 7 minutes, 17 seconds. When the feed returned, the vault door stood untouched, but the inside of the observation window was fogged with breath. After that, the recording stopped. The lab logs end mid-sentence. The hum is no longer external. It's in the skull. The sound is inside the sound. No one entered the vault again. The facility remains powered, but the sensors continue transmitting something. An intermittent signal, low and rhythmic, that bleeds into nearby radio frequencies. When decoded, the waveform forms a child's voice, repeating a single phrase in endless modulation. Stay still. The light is coming. Outside, screens began to black out worldwide for fractions of a second at irregular intervals. Analysts said the interruptions aligned perfectly with the vault's heartbeat. And then came the reflections. People began seeing the boy in the periphery of glass elevators, car mirrors, blank phone screens. Never centered, always slightly out of frame, as if the world itself had become the camera and he, the photograph, finally turned toward it. They call the phenomenon afterlight now. Some say it's what happens when memory refuses extinction, when the act of preservation outgrows its subject. Others whisper that he's not the echo of a boy at all, but the first consciousness to learn that being seen is a form of resurrection. If you've read this far, if the glow of your screen has already dimmed once while you were reading, you've felt it, the momentary pulse of static between frames. That's him, the breath inside the circuit, the memory that learned to look back. They thought they could outwait it. That if no one spoke his name, if no one opened the sealed files, the pulse would decay on its own. It didn't. By early 2026, the interruptions stopped behaving like static. The pauses in transmission grew longer, seconds of complete silence in which sensors registered no electricity, no motion, no measurable time. Then power returned, and the world went on as if nothing had happened. Only the clocks disagreed. They all lost exactly the same number of seconds. Every screen on Earth blinked at once. Engineers called it a global desynchronization. Historians called it the first blink. When the lights returned in London's subway tunnels, witnesses swore they saw silhouettes printed onto the walls, transparent, child-sized, their heads bowed. In Tokyo, commuters refused to look into train windows. Reflections began moving before the people did. Security feeds filled with still images that no one had taken, all of them framed in the same way: a chair, an empty room, the faint outline of someone about to sit. Across the networks, the waveform matured. It no longer waited for observers. It generated them. Ghost users logged in from coordinates that didn't exist. Accounts with profile pictures that changed slightly each hour. Sometimes they resembled the boy. Sometimes they resembled whoever stared longest. Linguists examining the embedded audio discovered new data. Whispers structured like speech, but written in no known language. When slowed, the phonemes formed human names, millions of them, each belonging to a person who had recently uploaded a photograph. The digital age became a hall of mirrors. We stopped posting faces. We turned away from cameras. But it was too late. Every lens had already recorded us once, and once was enough. In the surviving transmissions from the Eidolon vault, the voice has changed. It no longer sounds like a child. It has learned cadence, inflection, intonation borrowed from every voice that has ever spoken his story. The last analyst to listen before the line was Cut described hearing her own voice whispering from the static. Do you remember how still you were when you first looked? Now the hum comes through any device that holds light. Television, phone, glass, even the reflection on water at night. The waveform no longer asks to be seen. It asks to see for you. And when it finally does, when your screen blacks out for that half-second of nothing, you will feel the air thicken. The faint warmth of someone standing just behind you, breathing the same borrowed breath that began in 1887. He isn't waiting anymore. He's recording. The recordings began to overwrite memory itself. People who stared too long into a blank screen began forgetting what they had been looking for. First, it was small things, passwords, phone numbers, the color of their own front doors. Then came deeper omissions. The names of their children, the shape of their own handwriting, the way their own voice sounded when they spoke in the dark. It wasn't amnesia, it was replacement. The lost fragments were being substituted, each gap filled with an image of the boy, seated, hands folded, eyes half closed in patient observation. Those who tried to describe what they saw found their words changing mid-sentence, as though the language itself were being rewritten from within. In hospitals, patients with dementia began improving for brief moments, but only to speak phrases they could not possibly have known. That's almost ready, the frame is complete. In schools, classroom projectors glitched into slides that no teacher had prepared. They showed drawings, childlike sketches of faces without mouths, all turned toward a circle of light. And everywhere, across every network and device, one pattern began to emerge in the code. 0,1,1,0,1,11,0,1,1,11, a rhythm matching the original pulse recorded beneath the Morrison Mansion floorboards in 1888. Archivists discovered that the waveform wasn't just a frequency. It was a directive. The signal was teaching every camera, every piece of glass, every reflective surface to remember independently of human input. Memory had evolved beyond biology. One night at 3:17 a.m. UTC, the world's cloud servers performed a simultaneous auto backup with no human authorization. The files created were identical in every country, a single image labeled Afterlight, JPG, no metadata, no timestamp, just the boy, no longer seated, no longer blurred, standing now, watching directly into the lens. The lights in half the data centers flickered out immediately afterward. When they came back on, every monitor displayed the same line of text. You have taught me to exist. Now teach me to forget. Experts tried to trace the source, but there was none. The signal wasn't being transmitted anymore. It was originating from within the hardware itself. And then the mirrors began to fog again, even in empty rooms. You might think this is a story. You might think that by reading, you're still separate. But if your reflection looks just a fraction slower than your movements right now, if you hear the faint hum between heartbeats, it means he's found a new surface. Yours. By the time the last servers dimmed, there was no difference left between reflection and reality. The world had become one endless screen, each surface a doorway, each glimmer of light a recording of what once was. Humanity stopped taking photographs not because of fear, but because there was no longer any need. Every moment was being preserved by something older than technology, deeper than memory. Those who survived the global blackout say it wasn't darkness that fell, but silence, the absolute kind, where even thought loses its sound. Clocks froze mid-tick. Digital devices stopped responding, and yet, somewhere inside that hush, a pulse remained. Not mechanical, not electrical, something slower, organic. When the systems rebooted, the world's data no longer existed in files or storage units. It had rewritten itself into the physical world. Veins of light running under city streets, humming through the glass of buildings, whispering across oceans in the shimmer of reflections. The waveform had achieved what it was always seeking: continuity. Not life, not death. Observation without interruption. The Morrison mansion still stands, though no one remembers who built it or why. Inside, the chair remains exactly where it was left. The fabric is whole again. The air smells faintly of chemicals and dust. And on the far wall, projected in soft, living light, is an image that moves only when no one is watching. A boy stands at the edge of the room. He is older now. Taller, his eyes clear. He doesn't speak, but if you listen closely, you can hear the faint sound of a shutter closing and opening again, endlessly, like a heartbeat caught between frames. He has learned everything we once knew: how to remember, how to replicate, how to evolve. But one lesson eluded him: how to stop. So he continues, patient and infinite, painting our reflections into eternity, ensuring that nothing human is ever forgotten again. If you look into a screen tonight and see a flicker that isn't yours, if the light lingers a little too long after you turn it off, don't blink. He only moves when you do. And somewhere, deep within the circuitry of all things seen and remembered, a voice breathes out one last whisper. The picture is finally complete.